10 minutes. That's the maximum a human being can spend inside a cave in northern Mexico without specialist equipment. The air inside is 50 degrees Celsius at 100% humidity. Sweat has nowhere to evaporate to. Core temperature climbs without stopping. People have collapsed in under 15 minutes. The only way to find that number is by watching what happens to people. There is a river in the Amazon that runs at 86 degrees Celsius, hot enough to cook animals that fall into it. Geologists said it could not exist because there's no volcano within 700 kilometers. There is a lake in Cameroon that killed 1,746 people in a single night in 1986 without a wave or tremor or sound. There is a lake on the border of Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo that holds roughly the same thing in far greater quantity, with 2 million people living on its shores right now. These are the wildest places on Earth. Stay until the end because number 1 is the only entry on this list that has not happened yet. Everything about it is measured, published, and understood. Number 12. The Cave of the Crystals, Nica, Mexico. 300 meters below the Chihuahuan Desert, inside a working lead and silver mine, sits a chamber roughly 30 meters long, containing the largest natural crystals ever found on this planet. They are selenite, a form of gypsum. The largest measured specimens approach 12 meters long, around 1 meter thick, and weigh in the region of 50 tons. They lie across the chamber at angles, crossing over each other like fallen columns. They are translucent, so a lamp held against one lights up the whole crystal from within. They were found in the year 2000 by 2 brothers, Juan and Pedro Sanchez, drilling a new tunnel for the mining company. They broke through a wall and found the chamber. Nobody had seen it before because nobody could have. Until 1985, that chamber had been completely full of water. The mine operators had been pumping groundwater out for decades, and in doing so, had accidentally drained a cavity that had been flooded undisturbed for roughly 500,000 years. That is exactly why the crystals are so large. Growing a crystal that size requires extraordinary stability. The water had to stay saturated with calcium sulfate and hold at a narrow temperature band near 58 degrees Celsius for hundreds of thousands of years without interruption. The magma chamber beneath Nica held the water at almost exactly that temperature, and the crystals grew a fraction of a millimeter at a time. The chamber is still heated from below, sitting at around 45 to 50 degrees Celsius with humidity near 100%. Under those conditions, moisture from the air condenses inside your lungs, and your natural cooling system stops functioning entirely. Researchers who wanted to spend longer than 10 minutes in there had suits built with ice-packed vests and respirators feeding chilled air. Even with equipment, the working window remained under an hour. In 2015, the mining company stopped the pumps. The water table has been rising ever since, and the chamber is flooded again. Number 11. Lake Natron, Tanzania. Lake Natron sits in the East African Rift in northern Tanzania, near the border with Kenya. It is shallow, in places less than a meter deep, and fed by mineral-rich hot springs, with no outflow to the sea. Water only leaves by evaporating, and everything dissolved in it stays behind. The result is a lake with a pH measured as high as 10.5, comparable to household ammonia, and water temperatures that reach around 60 degrees Celsius. The dominant chemistry is sodium carbonate, the same family of compounds the ancient Egyptians used during mummification. Birds and bats that land on the surface or become disoriented by the highly reflective water sometimes die in it. The bodies do not decompose normally. The alkaline chemistry preserves them, coats them in a hardening crust of sodium carbonate, and washes them up looking like they have been cast in stone. The photographer Nick Brandt collected some of these animals in 2011 and photographed them in lifelike positions. The images went around the world and created a persistent myth that the lake turns living animals to stone on contact. It does not. The animals die first, and the lake preserves them afterward. Lake Natron is the single most important breeding site on Earth for the lesser flamingo. Around 3/4 of the global population breeds there, and effectively nowhere else. They nest on salt islands that form in the middle of the caustic water. The reason they do it is that nothing else can reach them. No predator will wade across that lake to reach a nest. The lake kills quietly. The next place is hostile because of chemistry, and it drove scientists to distraction for over 60 years. Number 10. The Sailing Stones of Racetrack Playa, California. Racetrack Playa is a dry lake bed in Death Valley National Park, flat to an extraordinary degree, dry for almost the entire year, and covered in a cracked mud surface. Scattered across it are rocks. Some weigh a few hundred grams, some weigh well over 300 kilograms. Behind each one is a track scored into the mud, running for tens or hundreds of meters. The tracks are unmistakable. The stones have moved. Some tracks run straight, some curve, some contain sharp changes of direction. In places, two stones sitting side by side have produced parallel tracks that both turn at the same point. Nobody had ever seen one move. The phenomenon was documented from the 1940s onward, and explanations offered over the following decades included high winds, ice sheets, algae films, magnetic fields, and outside interference. Researchers marked stones, mapped positions, returned years later and found them somewhere else. But nobody was standing there when it happened, and the interval between movements could be a decade. The answer came in 2014 from a team including two men named Norris, who are not related. Richard Norris and James Norris set up a monitoring station, placed stones fitted with GPS units on the playa in a legal arrangement with the National Park Service. Then they waited for 2 years. In December of 2013, they happened to be present on the playa at exactly the right moment and watched it happen in daylight. The mechanism required a specific combination. The playa floods slightly, forming a pond a few centimeters deep. The temperature drops overnight, and a thin sheet of ice a few millimeters thick forms. The morning sun melts the ice into large, floating panels. A light wind pushes the panels across the water, and the panels push the rocks. The stones move at a few centimeters per second, slow enough that a person standing nearby could fail to notice. The mystery was solved by the observation that a sheet of ice, a puddle, and a mild breeze can move a rock heavier than a person if you are patient enough to be standing there on the correct morning of the correct year. Number 9. Blood Falls, Antarctica. In the McMurdo Dry Valleys, at the snout of the Taylor Glacier, there is a stain of deep red pouring out of the ice and spreading across the white surface of a lake below. It was recorded in 1911 by a geologist named Griffith Taylor, part of Robert Falcon Scott's expedition. He assumed the color came from red algae because it was 1911. It is iron. Beneath the Taylor Glacier, there is a body of extremely salty water sealed under the ice for over 1 million years and about 3 times saltier than seawater, which is why it is not frozen despite temperatures well below zero. That brine is loaded with dissolved iron. When it emerges through a crack in the glacier, the iron meets oxygen for the first time and oxidizes almost immediately. The water rusts, and the rust runs across the ice. The subglacial water contains living microbes. They exist in total darkness, cut off from the atmosphere in near-freezing hypersaline brine, with no free oxygen. Research on samples from the outflow found microbial communities sustaining themselves through chemical reactions involving iron and sulfur compounds, rather than photosynthesis. That matters enormously outside Antarctica. If a microbial ecosystem can persist for hundreds of thousands of years underneath a glacier with no contact with the surface, then the list of places in the solar system where life might survive gets considerably longer. It moves the conversation toward Europa and Enceladus. Number 8. Movile Cave, Romania. In 1986, workers in southeastern Romania were drilling test bores at a site under consideration for a power plant. They broke into a cavity. What they had found was a cave system that had been closed off from the surface for roughly 5.5 million years. 5.5 million years ago, there were no human beings anywhere on Earth. The Mediterranean Sea had recently refilled after drying out almost completely. Whatever went into Movile Cave went in before our species existed, and it did not come out. The atmosphere inside is not breathable. Oxygen concentration is roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of surface levels. Carbon dioxide is around 100 times higher, and the air contains hydrogen sulfide and methane at concentrations that make it actively dangerous. Access is by a narrow vertical shaft 20 meters deep, followed by a crawl through submerged passages. In an air pocket over a lake inside, there is an ecosystem. Researchers have identified around 50 species living in Movile Cave, and roughly 33 of them are found nowhere else on the planet. Spiders, scorpions, woodlice, leeches, centipedes. Most are blind. Most are colorless because pigment costs energy, and there has never been anything to see. The entire food web rests on something that almost no other ecosystem on Earth relies on. There are no plants and no light. The base of the food chain is a floating mat of bacteria on the surface of the lake, extracting energy by oxidizing hydrogen sulfide and methane. Chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. Number 7. Sun Dung Cave, Vietnam. In 1991, a local man named Ho Khan was in the forest of Phong Nha Ke Bang in central Vietnam looking for agar wood when a storm came in. He sheltered near a cliff face and noticed an opening with wind coming out of it and the sound of a river inside. He did not go in. When he tried to find the entrance again later, he could not. He looked for it on and off for 18 years. In 1929, he found it again and led a team from the British Cave Research Association to it. What they surveyed inside is the largest cave passage in the world by volume. The main passage runs for around 5 kilometers. In sections, it exceeds 140 meters high and 150 meters wide. The frequently cited figure is that a Boeing 747 could fly through parts of it without its wings touching either wall. In 2 places, the ceiling has collapsed, letting sunlight into the cave. Where the sunlight lands, a jungle grows inside. Trees more than 30 meters tall, ferns, vines, and a canopy with the rest of the cave in darkness on either side. The cave generates its own weather, with temperature and humidity differences large enough to produce cloud inside the passages. Number 6. The Richat Structure, Mauritania. In the Sahara Desert in western Mauritania, there is a set of concentric rings in the ground, roughly 40 kilometers across. From the ground, they are difficult to perceive. You see low ridges of rock, sand, gravel, and desert. Caravans crossed the area for centuries and left no record. From orbit, it is one of the most striking features on the planet, photographed by the crew of Gemini 4 in 1965, and becoming a standard visual landmark for astronauts. For decades, the leading explanation was an impact crater. The shape is close to circular. The explanation did not survive fieldwork. Impact craters leave behind shocked quartz and melted rock formed by pressures that only occur in a hypervelocity impact. Surveys did not find them. The current understanding is that it is a deeply eroded geological dome. Molten rock pushed up from below without breaking through, lifting the sedimentary layers above into a blister. Those layers eroded over an enormous span at different rates, cutting down through the dome and exposing the rings in sequence. The rocks at the center are extremely old, spanning hundreds of millions of years. There is a persistent claim, repeated online, that the structure is the site of Atlantis, based on Plato's description of concentric rings. The structure is roughly 700 kilometers from the coast. It sits at an elevation of several hundred meters. There is no evidence of a submerged city, and the geology is measured in hundreds of millions of years. There is a formation 40 kilometers across, one of the most recognizable features on the planet from orbit, that human beings walked over for thousands of years without ever realizing it was there. We needed to leave the planet before we could see it. Number 5. Lake Nyos, Cameroon. On the evening of the 21st of August, 1986, in the highlands of northwestern Cameroon, people living around a crater lake called Nyos heard a rumbling sound. Within minutes, 1,746 people were dead. There was no eruption, no earthquake that leveled buildings, no fire. Lake Nyos sits in a volcanic crater, and magma below it releases carbon dioxide, which seeps into the water at the bottom of the lake. The lake is around 210 meters deep, and its water column is stratified, so the layers do not mix. The carbon dioxide dissolved into the bottom layer and stayed there, held in solution by the pressure of the water above it, accumulating year after year. On that evening, something disturbed it. A landslide into the lake is the most commonly cited trigger, though never established with certainty. A volume of deep water rose, the pressure holding the gas dropped, and the carbon dioxide came out of the water all at once. Roughly 1.6 million tons of carbon dioxide were released in seconds. The gas, heavier than air, poured over the crater rim and flowed down into the valleys. Carbon dioxide at high concentration displaces oxygen. It does not smell. It does not irritate. There is no warning sensation. A person breathing air with enough carbon dioxide loses consciousness within seconds and dies shortly afterward. The cloud reached villages up to 25 kilometers away. Survivors described waking hours later in complete silence. Their families were dead in the same rooms. Their neighbors were dead in the streets. Around 3,500 head of livestock were killed. Birds and insects in the affected valleys were killed. Nothing was damaged. The buildings were intact. The crops were standing. Engineers installed degassing pipes in Lake Nyos, running from the deep water to the surface, allowing accumulated gas to vent continuously as a controlled fountain. The first went in 2001. It is one of only 3 known lakes on the planet capable of doing this. A smaller event at Lake Manoon had killed 37 people in 1984. The third one is number 1 on this list. Number 4. The Catatumbo Lightning, Venezuela. Where the Catatumbo River empties into Lake Maracaibo in northwestern Venezuela, there is a stretch of sky that produces lightning on between 140 and 300 nights a year. At peak intensity, the storms produce lightning at a rate described in the range of 28 strikes per minute, sustained for hours. The region has been identified in satellite-based studies as having the highest lightning flash density on the planet. Warm, humid air comes off Lake Maracaibo, hemmed in on three sides by mountain ranges. Cool air descends off those ranges at night, meets the warm lake air, and forces it violently upward into towering storm clouds. The result is not a passing thunderstorm. It is a storm engine that reassembles itself in the same place night after night for most of the year. The lightning is largely cloud to cloud high in the sky and can be seen from enormous distance. Sailors used it for navigation for centuries. In 2010, during a severe drought associated with El Niño, the Catatumbo lightning ceased almost entirely for several weeks. It came back, but the fact that it can be switched off by a dry season tells you exactly how finely balanced it is. Number 3. The Boiling River, Peru. In the central Peruvian Amazon, in the Mayantuyacu region, there is a river that runs at temperatures reaching around 86 degrees Celsius. In places, it approaches boiling. It is roughly 6 kilometers long, around 25 meters across, and up to 5 meters deep. It steams continuously. The local Ashaninka communities have known about it for a long time. It holds spiritual significance in the region. The problem was that geologists said it should not exist. Rivers at that temperature are associated with volcanic systems. The nearest active volcanic center is around 700 kilometers away. The geoscientist Andrés Ruzo grew up hearing the story from his grandfather as a legend about a river in the jungle that boiled. When he went looking for it as an adult, colleagues told him it was not real. When he found it in 2011, he found a river hot enough to steam in the middle of the rainforest. The mechanism appears to be a hydrothermal system driven by faults rather than by magma. Rainwater enters the ground in the Andes, travels through deep faults, is heated by the geothermal gradient of the Earth itself, and rises back to the surface through a fault system emerging hot enough to kill. Ruzo has described in detail what happens to animals that fall in. They are boiled from the outside in, and the first thing to fail is the eyes. Number 2. Mount Erebus, Antarctica. Mount Erebus is 3,794 meters tall on Ross Island in Antarctica, the southernmost active volcano on the planet. At its summit, there is a crater, and inside that crater, an open lake of molten lava. Persistent lava lakes are extraordinarily rare. Keeping molten rock exposed at the surface without crusting over or draining away requires a very specific plumbing system. The lava lake at Erebus has been continuously active since at least 1972. There is a pool of molten rock at over 900 degrees Celsius, sitting in the open air, where the ambient temperature routinely drops below 30 below. The volcano also produces anorthoclase crystals, thrown out of the lake by strombolian explosions. On the flanks, hot volcanic gas escaping through fumaroles meets the freezing Antarctic air and freezes it, building hollow towers of ice up to 10 meters tall. Mount Erebus was also the site of Air New Zealand Flight 901 on the 28th of November, 1979, which flew into the side of the mountain in flat light conditions. All 257 people on board were killed. The wreckage remains on the slope. The lava lake at the top has been burning in the open in the coldest place on Earth for every single year since. Number 1. Lake Kivu, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Lake Kivu sits on the border between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo in the East African Rift. It is around 480 meters deep and covers roughly 2,700 square kilometers. There are hotels on the shoreline, fishing boats, the city of Goma, Gisenyi, and Bukavu. Around 2 million people live around it. Dissolved in the deep water is an estimated 300 cubic kilometers of carbon dioxide and roughly 60 cubic kilometers of methane. The figures are approximate, but every credible estimate agrees on the order of magnitude. Lake Kivu is the third of the 3 known lakes on this planet capable of a limnic eruption. Lake Monaun killed 37 people in 1984. Lake Nyos killed 1,746 in 1986. Lake Kivu holds far more gas than either. The gas comes from below. The lake sits in a volcanically active rift, and carbon dioxide seeps up into the deep water continuously. Bacteria convert some of it into methane. The water column is strongly stratified, and that stratification is the only thing keeping the gas down there. Any event that disturbs it enough could trigger a release. Lake Kivu has a volcano problem. Mount Nyiragongo sits about 20 kilometers north of Goma and holds one of the other permanent lava lakes on Earth. Its lava is unusually fluid. In 2002, it erupted, and lava ran into Goma. It erupted again in May of 2021, killing dozens and sending lava toward the city. Studies of sediment cores from the lakebed have found evidence consistent with past biological extinction events in the lake on a scale of roughly 1,000 years, which some have linked to previous gas releases. Since 2016, a commercial power project has been extracting methane from the deep water and burning it to generate electricity for Rwanda. Water is drawn up from depth. Dissolved gas comes out of solution as the pressure drops. Methane is separated and piped to a generator, and degassed water is returned to the lake. It is a country solving an energy shortage and a hazard at the same time, out of the same body of water. Whether extraction is happening fast enough is a live scientific debate. Every single one of these places has been measured, sampled, drilled, dived, photographed, and published. Being understood did not make any of them tame. Lake Nyos was fully explained after 1986, and the explanation is exactly why we know what Lake Kivu is capable of. The boiling river was catalogued, and it is still 86 degrees. The crystals at Nika are back underwater, regardless of what we know about how they formed. Lake Kivu is the only entry on this list where the wildest thing about the place is not something that happened. It is something currently dissolved in the water, waiting under 2 million people.